Hi all, and welcome to the Library Company's Fireside Chat for July. My name is Casey Schmitt, and I am a soon-to-be Associate Professor of History at Cornell University, and more importantly, an Executive Council member of the Library Company of Philadelphia's Program on Early American Economy and Society. The Fireside Chat series is part of the many programs offered by the Library Company of Philadelphia, which was founded in 1731 and continues today as an independent research library that holds one of the country's strongest collections of books, graphics, manuscripts, and importantly for the conversation today, maps that chronicle the history of American culture. This program is brought to you by the Program in Early American Economy and Society, affectionately known as PEAS, which supports advanced research in the history of American economy and society to approximately 1850. Here at PEAS, we define early American economy and society broadly to encompass topics that relate to political economy, agriculture, commerce, business, entrepreneurship, banking, money, transportation, labor, servitude, slavery, technology, the environment, cartography, oceanic and maritime circulations, and continental expansion, invasion, and resistance. If you didn't catch that, it is on the website. PEAS awards fellowships, organizes public and scholarly programs like this one, acquires relevant collection materials, and publishes scholarly monographs in its book series, which is relatively new with the University of Pennsylvania Press. So in other words, if you're not involved with PEAS, now might be a really good time to look into all of the cool things that we're doing. So I am delighted to welcome you all for this month's Fireside Chat to discuss this excellent new edited volume, there it is, titled Claiming Land, Claiming Water, Borders and the People Who Crossed Them in the Early Modern Atlantic. We are joined today by editor and contributor Rachel B. Herrmann, as well as two additional contributing authors for a really exciting roundtable conversation, Christian J. Koot and Samuel Truett. I would like to give each of them a brief introduction, and then the way it's going to run today is I will turn to some of the questions that I have for them about this book, their contributions, and the process of producing it. If you are in the audience and have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat at any point, and we will turn to those questions in the second half of our conversation today. So a few brief introductions. I'll start with Rachel. Rachel B. Herrmann is Senior Lecturer in Modern American History at Cardiff University. She is a specialist in the history of food, hunger, and cannibalism, and is turning her attention now to how people constructed, navigated, and undermined borders in the Gulf South on rivers, bays, coasts, islands, and swamps. Christian J. Koot is Associate Provost for Academic Affairs and Professor of History at Towson University. He is the author of two books on the Anglo-Dutch Atlantic and is also the co-founder and co-leader of the Unearthing TU History Project. His current book project examines the building and rebuilding of Tryon's Place in New Bern, North Carolina. And finally, we are joined by Samuel Truett, who is a professor of history at the University of New Mexico. He is a historian of borderlands and border crossings in North America and the world, with particular expertise in the US-Mexico border region and its indigenous, cross-border, and environmental contexts. So as I said, today we're discussing with an editor and three contributors the volume Claiming Land, Claiming Water, which just came out in March this year with the University of Pennsylvania Press. It's a really rich collection of essays that provides readers with a deep dive into how historians and geographers think about, interpret, and discuss both maps and borders before, during, and after the founding of the United States. So taken together, the contributions to the volume really serve as a model for how to interpret maps, not as sort of static historical facts, but rather as kinds of arguments being made by those who produced them. Equally important to the contributors across this volume is showing how maps can be read for evidence of people and places that were elided, renamed, and destroyed. So, across the different chapters, the contributors investigate how and why some people imagined and made claims to bounded space, and how and why other people confounded or challenged those claims broadly from the 1630s through the 1860s. And crucially, the approach in this volume is not a static one, but instead the contributors seek to explore how claims upon space and the power to enforce those claims required really evolving political, civil, military, fiscal, and cartographic technologies from a perspective of a wide array of actors on the ground. Now, what I really appreciated about the book as I read it was many things, but including the way that it bridges the two really dominant spatial paradigms that we use to understand movement and claims making. So Atlantic history and North American hemispheric or continental history. So, as the introduction to the volume makes clear, even though historians of the Atlantic world and North American continental history tend to share similar goals in revealing the entangled, multivocal space of the early modern world, often sometimes their geographic framings tend to pull in different directions in terms of theorizing space borders and zones of interaction. So the editors of the volume recognize the ways in which Atlantic and North American continental historiography has been siloed and responded by organizing a series of conferences with scholars who work across different fields in order to have conversations about maps, borders, movements, and early modern history. And the volume, of course, is a result of those conferences. But before we dig too much into the specific arguments of the volume and each of these contributions, I'd like to start the conversation today by asking each of you to reflect on what that experience at the conferences was like, what that experience of speaking across spatial paradigms was like. Specifically, whether those conversations brought anything to the surface for you in your own work, whether these were conversations that highlighted overlap or divergence, or potentially even disagreement about the importance of different approaches to early America. So for those of us who can only read the volume, what were the conferences leading to this volume like for each of you?
I guess I'll take this first, Casey, since Jessica, Roney, and I conceived of this network and put together the four conferences that informed it. So it's probably helpful for everyone to kind of have that background. Um, the first smaller conference we had was a kind of scoping exercise at the University of Southampton that kind of helped us begin a conversation about what it would look like to bring together various subfields. So we were interested in that conference and bringing together Atlantic and continental history, but also maritime history, Native American history, the history of borderlands. It was very big. Um, and that kind of informed our aim to put together a scholarly network with a group of interlocutors, including Sam and Christian, who would attend the first conference with the understanding that they would attend one of the two that remained. So we had our first event at the American Philosophical Society. And then the second was in Cardiff, and the third was at the British Library in London. Um, so my experience of putting together this conference was very much informed by my position as a migrant in the UK, who also needed to be an active researcher and do things like applying for grants, for the purposes of promotion. Um, and when I first got here, I was a migrant, and there were restrictions on how frequently I could be absent from the UK. And so the kind of point of the network was to bring a bunch of brilliant people to me, and for Jess and I to be able to be together to kind of think about these fields we were trying to bring together. So it was simultaneously a scholarly and personal endeavor from my perspective. Yeah.
I will say that I participated in I guess, the second one at the American Philosophical Society, and then the one at the British Library. And the one at the American Philosophical Society was more sort of seminar style, right? It was a smaller number of people. People had read each other's work before we came, and over, I guess, 2 days, there were some pretty incredible conversations. And then at the British Library one is a more traditional kind of conference with panels. But what was interesting to me about the span between them is it enabled me to read and revise the first piece that I had written and sort of rethink that. And for someone who has spent much of their career working in the Atlantic, thinking about the 17th century, thinking about maps in the 17th century, and I'm glad Sam is here because I hadn't really read a lot of Borderlands stuff since I had studied for comprehensive exams in the early 2000s. And going back to that work and thinking about borders in the continental North America and in the Americas really put into perspective for me this idea, what I was seeing in sort of the history of cartography, particularly that looks at the Atlantic and looks at Europe, and then sort of a narrative about the rationalization of space over the course of the 18th century and the increasing ability to use technology to mark boundaries of various kinds collides with this borderland scholarship, which makes all of that, throws all of that into question in new ways. So for me, it helped me rethink that sort of chronological story I was getting from one set of literature in a very, I think, important way.
So I was also at the same two conferences that Christian was at the APS and the British Library. And I think it's interesting to hear what you're saying about Kristen, your kind of interest in meeting up with Borderlands, because I think in many ways this was an opportunity for me to get out of the way that I'd normally been thinking about Borderlands. I was trained on the history of the United States and Mexico, and much of my previous work had really kind of focused on that land region between those two nations. But I was starting on a journey to follow this curious individual who I had stumbled across in the Huntington Library a number of years ago, who was a British sailor who winds up a villager in this small peasant village in Mexico. Um, and he writes this account of his first 15 years in Mexico, but that account will begin the middle of the story. And much of his story is on water, is in the Pacific, is in the Greater China Seas. And so I was trying to understand really kind of two things that this group helped me understand. One, how do I get out into maritime history and think about borderlandsy kinds of things? I think over time I became far more interested in border crossings, far more interested in just infrastructures in general that connected people between various places, whether on land and by sea. And then the other thing, my particular traveler starts off as an adventurer's apprentice in Borneo. When his master is killed by local tribal people on the coast, he joins a surveying crew in the East Indian archipelago. He then leverages that knowledge to become an opium trader between India and China, and then crosses the Pacific to Peru to the guano trade, and then from there joins thousands of others streaming north to the California gold fields in 1849. And then the group he falls in with is a mostly indigenous group that take him back to their home village in Mexico. He thinks he's going to get rich, but he ends up spending the rest of his life there. And what I kind of noticed across his larger trajectory is wherever he went, even though he was born a child of empire, he was moving primarily through indigenous spaces. And those indigenous spaces didn't have the same kind of temporal or period-centered logic that imperial spaces did. There was a lot about the worlds that he was moving through in the 19th century that were more like what we would call early modern spaces from our more Eurocentric way of thinking about things. So this group gave me a chance to hang out with early modernists, to kind of think about the ways they were thinking about the world, because in some ways, those relationships that they were talking about in their own work um, were more relevant to the kind of world making situations that I was seeing in the 19th century.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it seems like many of the contributions to this volume sort of are operating at the level of, as the title of course says, claiming land, claiming water, but thinking about, riverine spaces and thinking about, I think what you just said, Sam, border crossing and how sometimes these geographical frameworks actually get us thinking in sort of static geographic ways. But in fact, when you follow people or you follow rivers, I'm thinking about Rachel, your chapter in the volume, it sort of decenters how you think about the geographies that how we normally define them. So I suppose then for Rachel, is this the sort of conversations that you had and the way the volume turned out? Is this sort of how you expected it to go when you set about putting together these conferences and then soliciting contributions?
Oh, that's a great question, Casey. I I would be wrong to characterize any piece of writing that I myself produce as ending up where I expect it. So I don't know that it would be fair to compare any of my, let's just say that the essays in the volume exceeded my expectations is maybe the most concise way to put it. But I think I, as an editor, always approach edited book projects. I mean, I've done two. Um, I always approach them as the kind of fastest, easiest way to get up to speed with a bunch of scholarship that I don't feel I know. And so the experience of editing these essays has, of course, been an unexpected kind of building of my own knowledge. And we were talking in the kind of prep for this session about how that's impacted each of us as authors and as writers. And I was very candid about how um, exponentially my panic download folder has grown. The kind of benefit and risk of working across disciplines and across languages is that you just get exposed to so many more things that you know you should be reading. And so my panic download folder is my colloquial term for my to read folder in my list of secondaries for my next book project, which was kind of is related to this book in that the current monograph is very focused on rivers and these watery spaces. And this volume, Claiming Land, was my way of reading all the things I felt well, some of the things that I felt I needed to read in order to continue working on the new project.
I think everyone's panic must read folder is going to get a little bit bigger after reading this volume and sort of thinking more expansively about early America.
I hope
So
so.
I think so. I think so. So obviously, maps are very central to this book, like really, really central. There are around 20 historical maps reproduced, I think, throughout the book, and numerous others that serve as framing devices for chapters that aren't reproduced. And the way the maps appear in the volume and the arguments made about these maps, they're not just there to gesture towards where specific events occurred, but they're really essential to the arguments being presented in each of the chapters, especially as lenses onto the ways in which a wide variety of people made and contested claims to space. I found throughout my reading of the book, it was really powerful how each of you and the other contributors really show how to read maps as a way of understanding the making and unmaking of borders, but also how people used and destabilized these borders. So it's a really incredible collection of essays for thinking through maps as Rachel and Jess say in the introduction, historically contingent material artifacts that express really a range of desires, right, from different perspectives. So another question that I'd like to ask each of you is precisely about maps. For you as scholars, maps as tools for researching, teaching, and writing about early American history. So how and why do you use maps in your writing and teaching? And for the people who are listening to this who have not yet had a chance to read the volume, how did maps, as you were working on these chapters, allow you to think differently about aspects of your research or even early America more generally? So what did maps do for you as you were working through this? How do you use them in your scholarship more generally?
I'm happy to start. So my essay is about a map. It's about a pretty, um, in many ways, really standard map of the 17th century Atlantic. It's a map produced in 1676. It's a map of its two English map producers, Robert Morton and William Barry, and it's a map of New England, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia. And in many ways, it's a pretty standard map. It shows the essentially the coastline of the colonies from the Chesapeake Bay up until the coast of Maine. And it's got the sort of typical sort of inscribing of English space on the land. But it's also an incredibly unique map because the copy that I use, which is part of a collection of maps owned by a man by the name of William Blathwayt, who was a um, uh, uh, Secretary of the Board of Trade in England in the period. Um, and Blathwayt and his clerk, a man by the name of Thomas Povey, um, annotated the map. And the annotations they put on it are watercolor borders of the colonies of New England. So it's a map that is in many ways a unique expression of their thinking about maps. And one of the things I love about maps and what this map seems to show, I think, and why I think they're such important historical documents in my research is that they're both multimodal and multivocal documents, right? They're documents that are renderings of geographic space, but then are full with toponyms, right? Names for things. So there's a sort of narrative to them in that regard. They often have artwork on them, right? The cartouches are often depict indigenous people or a variety of imperial kinds of actors, whether it be commerce or conquest, soldiers, Native Americans, that add another story. And so when you think about sort of the layers of kinds of depictions on the maps, you can begin to see lots of different actors and lots of different voices in the maps, right? So we've got the people that collect the geographic information. We've got the people that put that together into images and depictions of space. And then we've got the artists that create them as engraved and printed works, all adding their own interpretations, their own voices to that story. So as historical artifacts, they capture multiple kinds of stories in one document, and we can begin to then use them. I think in both scholarship and in teaching, particularly, to tell those stories. They offer sort of gateways into those kinds of narratives. I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in to and I'll kind of focus on the map that I chose for my piece. I don't really I teach with maps all the time. But I really started my piece thinking more about the knowledge that kind of will ultimately show up on maps. I'm going to actually screen share this if I can, because I think it's just going to be easier to do it this way. Let me see if I can share it. I mean, the map I'm going to show you here is a very boring map. It doesn't have cartouches. It doesn't have the pretty colors that a lot of the other maps have. Um, this is a map of the state of Sonora in Mexico, where the border crossing individual that I'm writing about wound up. He winds up, this is just south of the present day state of Arizona. If you zoom in on this map here, you can see mountains, you can see towns along rivers, you can see the border between the states of Arizona and the state of Sonora here towards the upper part of the map. This is a map based largely on the local knowledge that my English globetrotter kind of gained when he realized he was never going to leave the village that he had settled down in. He had married a local woman. He had started raising a local family. He thought he would get rich in a Mexican bonanza, but he never did. And part of the reason for this is that his kind of, if we want to call them modern visions of transforming space, ran up against the reality that most of the region that he lived in were controlled by indigenous peoples who had different ways of thinking about space and different designs on space. It's not really until the end of his own life, the end of the 19th century, that nation states are able to come in with new infrastructures based around things like railroads and so forth. When he finally sits down towards the end of his life and he writes an account of his time in this space, he draws a map of the space that he's in. And the map here is then traced from that map by a civil engineer in Chicago, working with railroad magnates with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, who were looking to build down into Mexico. And so this is a map, in many ways, his last attempt to possibly enrich himself, to make things better, if not for himself, then maybe for his children, by encouraging railroad companies to build south. And this is this is kind of the visual data that he gives them to do this. One of the things that is really interesting about this map is that there are no railroads. There are very few points above the current day United States-Mexico border. This is a time when Apaches are largely controlling much of this area. And the people who are printing up this map are also tied up with the military conquest of Apaches in the later 19th century. And the one dotted line through the middle of this map is the anticipated route of a railroad that never gets built, at least not in this particular area. So this is a kind of aspirational map that really, if you kind of zoom into it, shows a more more river-oriented space tied in much earlier centuries, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, when people were and villagers were much more oriented kind of locally. So this map gets printed. It doesn't really come to any use for the people to the north. The individual that I'm looking at was mathematically trained. He knew how to make maps like this. It's a map that seeks precision and a kind of Western sort of way of looking at things. But I think one of the ironies is that his final use to the village was creating a very different kind of map, which I don't include. And this map, and I'm just going to kind of close out of this thing here, is a map of local ejidos, or village community lands. And he draws this map up for the community so that they can defend their village from railroads, from the new modern land markets that are coming in with railroads. So the one map that he produces that we can see, at least sort of as a broader audience, is in many ways diametrically opposed to the map that he actually creates that's of use, the one that actually becomes useful to the community, which also exists, but it's much more buried in the archives of northern Mexico. So again, that's where maps kind of fit in with the particular story that I told, kind of really kind of showing how there's this kind of tension between modernizing impulses of modern nation states and railroad companies and others to kind of pin space down. And then there are these more native-centered efforts by villages, like the one that he lived in, to draw up alternative maps that would in many ways kind of resist the dislocations of this same modern world.
And I will say I have a chapter in the book that doesn't deal with any maps, but the work of producing the volume has fundamentally changed that forevermore, I think, for me moving forward. So I'm interested now in maps, a mix of printed engraved maps, but also a bunch of manuscript maps in the Archivo General de Indias. And I'm interested in thinking about these rivers and indigenous towns that appear and disappear on maps over time. And I'm interested in counter readings of spaces on maps depicted as empty to instead kind of cross-reference these places on maps with their descriptions and other contemporary primary sources. And I think if we do this, we become able to see and recognize and acknowledge the presence of indigenous people, of deer and cattle herds on the move. And so I'm interested in kind of critical readings of these places. I'm interested in kind of editorial changes to library catalogs that are better able to recognize anonymous indigenous co-authors. So I'm interested in using maps to expand our notion of archives and sources. And I'm particularly interested in using maps as in teaching. Almost every seminar that I teach now includes at least one map. Part of this is about meeting my students where they are and having us be able to come to seminar to maybe look at something that not everyone has had as much time ahead of seminar to consider as we might have liked, because images are kind of I think images are harder to analyze well, but they are easier for everyone to come and be able to say something. And so I use lots of different maps in my teaching too.
Yeah, this is all amazing answers, and I'm thinking specifically about the ways in which the volume really forces the reader to think about maps as aspirational in a lot of ways, functional in other ways, and sort of makes you think about for whom is the map aspirational, for whom is it functional, and sort of thinking through these different scales is really what many of the chapters do really force you to do as the reader. I do want to take a pause for a moment and remind everyone in the audience that if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. We will turn to those in just a second. But before we turn to those, I had another question for each of you that appropriately for a conversation about maps and about their different uses is actually about scale. I think maybe a clunky, not very cartographically informed thinking of maps would think of them as really sort of top-down views of early America. You know, I was struck by, Rachel, what you said about indigenous villages that appear and disappear. I think we tend to think of maps as being produced by imperial planners for specific purposes that can lead to disappearances and erasures in that way. But again, I was really struck reading this book, the ways in which the contributions approached maps, borders, and early American history from a variety of scales, right? That forces you to think through everything from the machinations of imperial planners with their shading on maps and the ways that they shade maps on a continental scale to really the experiences of a single individual or a series of individuals. So I wanted to ask each of you about how scale factors into the ways in which you think, write, teach about maps. And perhaps a sort of side question to add onto this is about the scale of the maps themselves, the physicality of the map and how maybe that influenced your approach to reading them or teaching them or thinking about them critically. So a kind of big, broad question about scale and maps and sort of how this fit into your approach to your work in this volume.
I can start. I mean, I think one of the things I was in re-looking at some of the essays this week in anticipation of this event. One of the essays I reread was Paul Musselwhite's essay, which is about the construction of the space of a plantation, essentially, and the idea of what a plantation meant in the 17th century. And one of the reasons I bring it up is because Paul in that essay uses other maps from the same collection that my essay is drawn from this William Blathwayt collection, which is a collection of, I think, just over 30 maps that Blathwayt assembled in the 1670s as he's trying to understand the scale of the British Empire, right? This is a moment in the 1670s in which the empire has expanded pretty dramatically in the last half century. And the British, particularly sort of colonial administrators like Blathwayt, are interested in trying to get a sense of what their empire looks like. And the way they go about that, and the way Blathwayt goes about that, is by buying commercially available maps to essentially have this map library in the Board of Trade. But what he's forced to do is buy maps at all kinds of different scales. So a map like the map that I write about, which captures it's a relatively small map for a relatively large geographic area, to maps of individual colonies, to even some smaller maps as well. And he goes to some of these maps come from Northern Europe. They're Dutch maps, they're French maps in the collection, and they're English maps in the collection. And one of the things that's striking when you go to the John Carter Brown Library, or any of our viewers can go to their incredible online map viewing software. And the John Carter Brown has done a great job of digitizing their cartography collection. You can see the Blathwayt Atlas, and you can page through these maps. And as you do this, it's disorienting, right? The scale changes as you go from small to big. And what that does is brings into relief, I think, how hard it is, even for architects of empire at this moment, to conceive of this sort of empire that they've built, how they see that empire is shaped by these technological objects and by the different needs and concerns of the people who made these maps. So in thinking about those maps, one of the things that it helps us, I think, understand is that there in many ways was no such thing as an English empire in the 17th century. There are different elements that they've kind of knit together, but don't fully necessarily fit together. So that idea of scale in some ways is very literal in that way. Another really important thing, I think, about thinking and using these maps is how at different scales of viewing, they represent very different things. So if you look at the map that I use, or even that map that Sam just showed, right, from the sort of overall view of that map, there's one story. But as you zoom in, as you get closer, as you begin to see some of these details, the towns that appear and disappear that Rachel's talking about, a whole nother story comes into view. And I think it captures in many ways the ways that early modern viewers also experienced these maps and would have used these maps, thinking as they got closer. And there is evidence of them using magnification to look at these maps, right? So they too are experiencing them at these different scales.
Rachel and I are muting and unmuting here. Rachel, do you want to go? I was hoping you would say something equally brilliant that I could then kind of piggyback on. I should be thinking about scale quite a bit, following individuals through the world, kind of thinking about smaller scale humanized histories and how those add up to larger globe crossing sorts of histories. But I'm going to actually kind of turn a little bit away from the piece I wrote for this book and kind of talk a little bit about how I think about scale and indigenous roles in mapping. I just finished a 3-year project that I co-led with a colleague here at the University of New Mexico on native trails for the National Park Service's National Trails system, to kind of begin to sort of imagine what would happen if the National Park Service and its obsession with trails thought about people who weren't settlers and kind of thought about how they might visually or verbally represent those kinds of spaces. And the project, this was really a project to recruit a native graduate student who I'm working with, a Mescalero Apache woman who ended up deciding that she wanted to kind of move the project to a system of trading networks and just relationships that extended from Isleta Pueblo, just south of Albuquerque here in New Mexico, out to the coast of California, running through the Colorado Plateau of northern New Mexico and northern Arizona, and kind of focusing in particular on this really interesting um, pair of maps that she found buried within um, a railroad surveying account by a guy named Emil Weeks Whipple, which was carried out in the 1850s by individuals basically kind of traveling west across where Route 66 runs today towards California with native guides to think about the potential of building a railroad across this area, which ultimately happens. And wherever he goes, he's with native guides or he's meeting up with native peoples who are giving him spatial knowledge. Um, and it's interesting to kind of think about how scale works in these cases. At some points, they're they're talking with individuals who are helping them get from point A to point B, and they're the maps that the native peoples are drawing for them on the ground are very small scale maps with scoops kind of pulled, kind of taken out of the dirt and filled with water to kind of show watering holes to basically kind of say, here's where camp 1 is, here's where camp 2 is, and by day 3, you're going to be at this point over there. Good luck. From those kinds of maps to much larger scale maps, for example, the pair of maps that my student found embedded in this account that native peoples on the Colorado River drew of the lower Colorado River. And these are maps that run from the Gulf of California all the way up into the Colorado Plateau area. They're maps that can be georeferenced onto current day maps. So they kind of resonate with our Western ways of thinking about Cartesian space and so forth. They're much larger scale maps, and they have a different kind of work. Rather than showing how to get from point A to point B, what they're expressing to these railroad surveyors is a sense of political space. The maps show how these people are allied with neighboring people and how those alliances in military blocks, because you have groups that are sometimes at war with one another, articulate themselves along this space of the Colorado River. And I think, as Christian and others who work on maps from a primarily European perspective would argue, these same kind of politics follow maps with non-Indigenous folks as well. What I think we became really interested in with this project was how Native peoples too kind of scaled up or scaled down when they were articulating visually their sense of relationships within given spaces. And I think one of our large hopes would be, and this is something where I think, kind of returning to Rachel's piece really kind of helps me think about this as well, is how in settler maps might we find all kinds of traces of this indigenous cartographic knowledge, often because it's native peoples who are serving as guides. It's native peoples who are telling people how to get from point A to point B. And then the question is, how might we then be able to kind of read those visual articulations for indigenous politics as well? And that's where we're hoping to go next with this Native Trails project, is to kind of think about using indigenous maps as a way of thinking much more broadly about political spaces, political infrastructures, political borders, etc.
And if I could just add to that, I think one of the interesting things is, what does it then mean that a map of a imperial territory in the Americas is only made possible because of indigenous informants who have provided the data for it? What does that mean for that place being part of some imperial claim? It makes all those things even more complicated.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in terms of scale, I think everyone on this call has had the experience of kind of finishing out a workday with your face an inch away from the screen because you're trying to see a map that was never meant to be fitted onto a tiny laptop screen. So many of these maps need to be seen up close and in person. And so thinking about the physicality of a map and its scale has changed the way I am physically present in an archive. I am now scheduling in map days where I know I'm going to be up and walking around a table because I'm going to be looking at an object that is so much larger than the manuscripts that I tend to be looking at. Or I'm going to be so much more dependent on an archivist's help to help me unfold a tiny map in a book because they have a much smaller chance of damaging it than I do. So it's kind of, yeah, it's changed my physical research practices, my appreciation for the archivists who manage these objects, and some of the limitations of trying to come away from the archives and to continue working on objects like this. And I've talked a little bit about some of the challenges of trying to look at maps of Louisiana and Florida in the AGI, because these are all just digitized in the salon on microfilm. They're digitized online, but what you can see in microfilm in the reading room is a much higher quality. Um, so I'm still working on my note-taking practices and navigating the image permissions process, which takes, 5 months and requires a hard copy form. But it also means that I am thinking in other chapters and other pieces of work about the absence of maps and why maps weren't produced. So my chapter for this volume is about a failed surveying expedition that does result in some maps that are fairly misleading because they contain lots of calculations and astronomical figures that really, if you were reading them not alongside the context of the surveyor's journals, would make places seem much more accessible than they really were, particularly because of the resistance of indigenous Creeks and Seminoles who make the survey impossible to complete, as I argue in my chapter, by setting the Okefenokee Swamp on fire. So the size of a map and its scale does inform how we work with it, but sometimes we need to think about why a map might not appear at all, and what that tells us about the conditions in which it was attempted to be produced.
Rachel, that comment you made about archives, I think is really important, and it made me think about how, when we think about maps too, one of the other things, and I think this is sort of about scale, hopefully we haven't gone too far from Casey's question, is the way that maps are archived. So in thinking about the National Archive in the United Kingdom, for example, they made the decision in the early 1920s to take maps out of the other manuscript collections. So the collection of letters from Massachusetts, for example, they removed all the maps and put them in a separate collection where they still reside today. So that today the letters about the borders of Massachusetts are divorced from the maps that they're actually sending back and forth across the Atlantic as they debated it, which my article in my chapter in this volume talks about. So in many ways, as historians, we need to put those two sets of things back together, right? And allow the maps and the other kinds of archival documents to talk to one another in order to really uncover the story that's being told.
Yeah, I mean, I would just kind of add to that. I mean, there is something about, and I'm agreeing with Rachel here very much. There's something about the physicality of maps that is sometimes lost when you're kind of tiling on a static screen that's always kind of the same size and you're kind of zooming in and zooming out. There's something just breathtaking, especially with very large maps in particular, that you have to walk around huge tables to kind of look at, and sometimes with the little kind of magnifying glass to look at all the little details. But it is interesting and frustrating that maps and written text tend to be disaggregated the way that Christian says. And I'm reminded of the work that I've done in the British Library, for example, in London, where I'm constantly running between, I can't remember what it is, floor 1 and floor 3 or 4, wherever it is that the map room is, between the manuscript that I'm reading and the map that supposedly goes with the manuscript, which I have unfolded on a table upstairs. And someone has been kind enough to let me kind of run back and forth between the sort of the two floors to kind of look at. Um, I don't know. I guess at my age, I'm getting in steps. That's a good thing, to have to go from one floor to the other. But it sort of, yeah, that disaggregation creates certain physical challenges for us as historians.
Well, this conversation about, the production of maps and where they're housed and whether they're disaggregated from manuscripts builds on one of the questions we have in the chat from Donald, who wants to, he says that most of the maps would have been fairly expensive to produce and purchase, correct? And he wants to know whether these maps were ever used to make claims of status and authority in one's local community, as well as claims to ownership and authority over space. So this is, each of you is clearly poised to talk about this, but so the cost of maps and then these claims of status and authority.
Um, so yes, these maps, I mean, so there's a whole, and scale actually gets at this. There's a whole variety, but maps are relatively expensive in the English early modern world, for example. Before the only there are no maps in British North America, for example, that are produced locally until the very end of the 17th century, but not really until the middle of the 18th century. So in the colonies, these are imported objects, so they are more expensive. But even in a place like London, maps are relatively expensive. There are, of course, a whole variety of maps. Map producers by the end of the 17th century are very good at producing relatively small versions of maps that are cheaper, right? And that's one of the reasons why they're doing that is there's a growing sort of map consciousness and people want to buy these. So they're available to sort of middling kinds of professionals who could buy these things. But they certainly are objects of status. Many of the maps, for example, in the Blathwayt Atlas in the 16 that Blathwayt is buying in the 1660s and 1670s, are owned by Samuel Pepys, right? The famous diarist of 1660s London. And Pepys, who's a naval administrator, is kind of buying them for work, but really he's buying them for his own library. And he talks in his diary often about inviting people over and looking at maps together, right? And this is a particular male kind of educated activity that is, as the question asks, really all about status and all about sort of a gentleman's um, capacity to understand the world, right? And his ability to house that in his own book presses. And that is definitely about status merged together with this imperial ideology.
I'll say that the map, the survey expedition, the failed survey expedition that does produce some maps, is expensive in terms of time. So the point of the survey expedition is to speak to one of the articles in the 1795 Treaty of San Lorenzo, which sets out a dual binational American and Spanish survey expedition to map the border between Spanish Florida and U.S. Georgia, running west to the Mississippi. They start on the Mississippi River and move east. It's like a 3.5 year expedition. It's expensive in terms of money and provisions for the overland baggage train that's trying to follow this expedition, even though like all the recommendations are that they enter the points to survey by rivers and head inland. It's expensive in terms of the many lives of enslaved Africans who supply the expedition, and then go home for harvest, at which point the white survey members complain about the additional work that they need to do. Um, and the kind of failure doesn't do a great job advancing anyone's career, either the career of Stephen Miner, who's working for the Spanish, or Andrew Ellicott, who's working for the Americans. So I'm not sure that I would say that manuscript maps by the end of the 18th century are used in the same ways to advance individual people's careers and reputations. But Christian is much more of a proficient and established map scholar than I am, and Samuel might know more about places west of the Mississippi. So that's just kind of a preliminary guess, but certainly expensive in terms of effort, money, and lives lost. Let's say that.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to all of this because I think the answer to this question about status, authority, the cost of maps, et cetera, changes quite radically once you get to the 19th century. And here's kind of this moment where I live with an early modernist. She does primarily 16th and 17th century literature. And she's always joking that I'm hanging out with other early modernists, for example, in this group here. And I say, well, but I am an early modernist. The early modern era is really expansive. And she's like, no, you're not. You're a 19th century person. And this is one of those kind of moments where I feel like I hear her voice very much in my ear, because if I'm thinking about the maps, okay, so I mentioned two maps. One was the map that was produced, that was traced from the hand-drawn map that my villager, my stranger turned villager kind of produced, and then was used to kind of anchor railroad dreams of expansion down into Mexico. And then there was the other map, the map of the ejidos, or the common lands, that gets kind of buried away in a local archive that he draws for the village itself. Maybe kind of starting with that village map, does he have any claims to status and authority within the community for having drawn this map? I don't think so. I think in many ways, the community understood very well what the map needed to do. They already had, for many generations, a kind of a sense of how these visual things kind of were connected to politics and so forth. He just had mathematical training that put him in service of the community very briefly while this thing was kind of drawn out. I've seen the map of the ejidos, and I know where families actually lived in the community, and the map and the reality have nothing to do with one another. It's just a completely abstracted kind of document that's created to kind of fend off land speculators at this time. And I don't think any of his kids or grandkids even remember him drawing this map. And the map that is, kind of created for the account in Chicago, I mean, it costs a fair bit. I mean, it has to be engraved. It has to be, kind of like, it's printed alongside the typeset version of his travels and adventures in Mexico. It's probably fairly costly because it's not a huge run. They're for presentation copies that are given to railroad magnates. 5 copies of the book survive. Only one of those copies has the map affixed. And it's kind of like a book collector's version or whatever of disaggregating the map in the book, or maybe even not book collectors, but the people who had the book before. I don't think the map really meant anything to them. I mean, people who were going down into Mexico to invest in mining were not bringing the maps from booster accounts with them to figure out how to get from one place to the other. They were just traveling well-worn roads, and they were kind of going where locals told them to go. And they were ultimately following that kind of local knowledge to get from point A to point B. So they were, in a sense, kind of presentation pieces, the maps were. But as you saw in the map I showed you, it wasn't pretty. It was kind of a humdrum, boring kind of presentation piece. And really, in the larger scheme of things, not very interesting, not very costly at all. And ultimately, I think what survives more in that particular case are the words, rather than the kind of the visual document that goes along with it. So I feel in so many ways, all of the ways I'm thinking about answering this question is at variance. It feels like I'm in a completely different temporal space than Christian or Rachel.
And this is, I'll jump in here and say this is, as a reader, one of the real benefits of this volume is reading these arguments about maps and borders and claiming of space across the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. You get a sense of the different ways in which you, as scholars of different time periods and different spaces, think about and use maps in a really useful, and for me, at least thinking forward, in a very classroom accessible way. I think it's going to be a great volume for getting students to think about the different ways maps are used and what they mean across different periods and geographies. So we are close to time. I want to make sure that if there was anyone who's in the audience who wanted to get in a last minute question for any of our contributors, that we give them a second for that. And if any of you have a last comment about this conversation about the volume, feel free.
I think one of the things that I would be remiss in not mentioning on Jess's behalf is her sense that the library company is still learning about what maps it has on file, and with an eye toward anyone who's attending this webinar who is interested in doing research or supervising PhD or early career students. I think, a kind of slightly bossy fellowship application saying what research and maps that the library company might find could be well received. There's potentials for research there, and we should plug the library company in the first instance.
I think that's a great way to end, beginning talking about the library company and end with a plug for the library company. So anyone has not gotten their hands on this volume yet, I highly recommend it, and thank each of you so much for being here for this conversation.